Welcome to episode 145 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Michelle Auerbach, author of Resilience, the Life-Changing Skill of Story. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. Michelle Auerbach. She and I met a few weeks back by an introduction from another podcast where we had both recently been guests, and it was clear we had a lot in common. And somewhat serendipitously, when we had our getting to know you conversation, I learned that Michelle's work was all about the power of story while I was working on the curriculum for my upcoming class on creating better presentations using behavioral economics and story for Texas A&M University. It seemed like the perfect time to chat and talk more about stories. By the way, that class at A&M is part of our mini-mester setup, so it's only 3 weeks long and begins April 10th. Enrollment's open now, and there is, of course, a link for you in the show notes. This course was requested by a student and is already proving very popular, so come check it out. You don't need to do the full certificate program to take the class, so you could just take this one or maybe dip your toe in to see how you like the format on this 3-week class that gives continuing education credits. It's all about giving better, more persuasive presentations and incorporating story into them because, as you'll hear in the conversation with Michelle today, emotion is needed to make decisions, and stories evoke emotions. In life and in business, you are constantly asking people to do things. You need them to make decisions. Wouldn't it be nice if you could make that process easier? Great news. Now you can with these stellar insights from Dr. Auerbach, and if you take my class, of course. During the conversation, we touch on several concepts that have their own past episodes, including those on novelty and stories, nudges, framing, status quo bias, dose brain chemicals, and many more. Those are all linked for you in the show notes, along with links to connect with Michelle and get your own copy of her book, Resilience. It can all be found within the app you're listening to or at thebrainybusiness.com/145. Those already on the Brainy Business list got a direct link from me in the email you receive every Friday. Not on the list yet? Simply sign up for any freebie at thebrainybusiness.com and you'll be automatically added. And for those of you in the States, you can sign up easily by texting the word Brainy, BRAINY, to 33777. You'll be added to the list and get access to a super secret subscribers page with more than 50 freebies as a thank you. All right, let's jump right in. Without further ado, Dr. Michelle Auerbach, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we didn't necessarily talk about it, but I feel like as far as a good story, a way to really kick this off, I'm not sure. I feel like I'm one of the first maybe like dozen people getting to introduce you as Dr. Auerbach, because as 2 days ago, you said you defended your dissertation.
Yeah. So thank you for doing that because it makes it real. I think there's going to be a certain amount of repetition necessary.
Absolutely. I feel like, well, you don't want to be telling everyone that they have to call you that, but I try to definitely, whenever someone who's on the podcast, if I know they have a doctorate, I will go out of my way to at least introduce them as doctor at least once, just to make sure, because there's a lot of work that goes into that. So congratulations again.
Thank you.
Yeah. So tell the group, the audience, a little bit about you and what your background is. I know we're going to be talking a lot about story today, but I know you have a varied past, let's say, of different kind of careers along the way. So just tell a little bit about where you started, where you are now, and anything interesting as you go.
So I started out in Cleveland, Ohio, sitting under the piano at any family gathering, reading a book. That would be definitely like the The Genesis story. I was the kid under the piano with the glasses on, reading the book while everybody else was having a family event. And that has not changed. Well, I mean, I have to behave appropriately in public now, but I
need a really big piano to sit
I need
under.
a big piano and a smaller book. No, but story has always been an enormous part of my life. And when I was a kid, I was pretty sure I was either going to be a Supreme Court justice or a folk singer. Those were the two things that were going to happen. And they weren't that different in my mind, right? You were righting wrongs and redressing harm either way, either by music or by law. And so those were my paths that I carried with me. I have a terrible singing voice. So when I went to college, I ended up majoring in literature, and I got a writing degree. I got an MFA in writing, and I was a professor for a long time of ancient world languages and literature. I do Sanskrit and Latin and a little bit of Greek and Hebrew and, old French and old Italian, all these kind of interesting things. And I loved them because of the way that the stories actually transmitted information about what it was to be human. That the stories were incredible receptacles for information. It was like a data dump, honestly. Like if you wanted to know what it was like to feel omnipotent and to be brought to your knees, you read Beowulf, or you read, right, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And those stories, the plot was great and it dragged you along, and the characters are interesting and the details are cool, and there's like snakes and chalices and all that stuff. But what was fascinating to me was just what it meant about humanity and being human and being present in the world. And so I was professoring, and I had somebody offer me, while I was on my sabbatical writing a book, offer me a chance to do some work in a corporate environment with a client who was struggling really badly because they had realized, or it had been brought to their attention, that they'd done some harm in the world and they needed to fix it. And they were struggling more with how they felt about it than with what the solutions were. The solutions were kind of obvious, like you have to fix it. But I went in thinking the only thing I would ever do was teach college. And I left thinking I want to do change management in organizations, because it's a place where all of the wisdom that we've been handed down shows up and helps people in their real everyday life. Like, it's great to talk about it in the classroom. I loved teaching literature and creative writing. I thought it was great. But when you actually walked into a room where those stories helped people change their attitudes, their behaviors, their actions in ways that allowed them to do a better job in the world of being good citizens, corporate citizens, and individual citizens, that was like stunning to me.
Yeah.
So that's the story of how I ended up here. And that was about almost 15 years ago. And so I've been doing organizational change, which includes like leadership development, that kind of stuff, but working with organizations to develop culture and change for, a while now. And it all really did start under a piano bench in Cleveland, Ohio.
Awesome. So, I mean, if you think, just to expand a little bit, so there is an episode on change management I'll be linking to, and most of the audience knows I teach a class on change management and internal communication. And we happened to get connected as I was working on curriculum for a class at Texas A&M about power of story and presentations, and then told me what you did. And I thought, well, this is perfectly timed. And so, here we are. So when you look at change, how does story impact, helping people to be more likely to change? Or is it about learning more about themselves, or having more empathy with others, plus more, sort of, what do you look at when you talk about story and its impact on change?
So this is a good question, right? It was part of my dissertation. Story does a couple of four really important change tasks. The first thing it does is it's biologically based. And so it has a somatic impact on the way that you take in information, right? So that's an important thing. The second thing is that it is, it helps you to co-regulate with the person telling the story, right? So there's a safety aspect to it. It also does learning really well. Like when story is an intrinsic part of learning, and it doesn't matter. I remember I was studying art history in college, and we had to memorize the names, dates, artists of paintings, and you'd look at the painting and have to like draw this information from your brain And we would make up little stories about the painting that included, all of the bits of information. And then we would like act them out as a way to memorize it. And I didn't know at the time how actually useful that was, but that story moves stuff from your short-term memory across, into your long-term memory and allows you to hold on to information. So I can still like make the shape of my body I made when I was memorizing the name of the Brancusi, thing that I was memorizing. And it's all still there, many, many, many decades later. So it does that. And then it also allows you to see possibility that you wouldn't necessarily see otherwise, because story by default is not, it feels in your body like it's happening, but it's not. So you're able to take in a lot of information about different possibilities, different experiences, and they call this transportability when they talk about story. But it's a fabulous way to share possibilities with people. So if you're giving presentations and you're doing communication and you need to tell people stuff that's either not yet true, or that you want to be true or that's going to happen, they can live it a little bit. And that helps them to feel it and understand it and see it. So if you give people a pie chart and you just say 67% of our whatever is lost because of whatever, 67% of our profit is, blah, blah, blah. And people look at the pie chart and they're like, well, that's a big number.
Yeah.
Like,
okay.
I guess, I care about that number. But if you tell them the story of what it would be like to recapture that missing 76% and how that would feel in their job, they're going to be like, oh yeah, I'm right on that. And so story does those things. And it's just a biologically based like mechanism for actually getting stuff done well.
Right. I work with story and with so many of my clients, and knowing we're coming from a marketing and brand strategy communication background, there is a lot of helping to tell a good story to draw people in, and with those, I'll have a client maybe that's talking about helping underprivileged, or those who don't have good access to money for, credit unions I've worked with in the past, things like that. And same, they want to have the example of, 60% of households don't have enough saved for a $500 emergency or whatever it is. And I'll always recommend we need to start with like, that's great. That's fine. There are some reasons I wouldn't share it that way anyway. But before you get to that statistic, you want to say like, this is Sarah. She's a nurse and is working an extra job to help take care of her kids and get them to soccer practice, worried about if she has enough money for milk and the field trip, whatever, and is, walking to the kids to school because she can't, or taking the bus. You tell the story and then say, she is one of the X million Americans that blah, and we can help them. We can help Sarah and everyone else by this. And that's where you get kind of those goosebump moments, especially if it's a real person that you're able to relate to. And a lot of businesses I find have a hard time when you hear someone else's story, you get why one is valuable, but you don't want to just focus on one person because it feels like you're not telling enough. You're not getting the whole thing out there. But, if you really, really, really focus on one great story, we feel everyone else, it has so much power behind it. Do you have any insights on why and how that works?
Yeah. My insights are this: cortisol and oxytocin.
Yes.
Right. So what storytelling does is, there's just so much going on in our lives all the time. And way more information is coming into our brains than we actually are aware we're taking in. And we tend to, our brain decides basically what to pay attention to. And so in that environment where attention is a pretty limited resource, stories heighten, there'll be a character you care about. And then something will happen to them that puts them in jeopardy or what I call makes trouble. And what that jeopardy or that trouble does is it focuses your brain. You're like, whoosh, right there. I'm here. I'm paying attention to this because this could be me. And I can learn from this experience by hearing it. And then I would behave differently and it wouldn't have to happen. And your brain actually marks it in the same way that it would mark some other danger to let you know, like, pay attention. So that's the cortisol effect. And I think cortisol gets a bad rap. People always think, it's the stress hormone, but actually it's what gets you out of bed in the morning. You need it. Without it, you'd be like a, boneless chicken. So you need it. And then the other thing that happens is you care about Sarah, right? And you want her kids to get a good education and you want her job to go well. And that produces oxytocin in your bloodstream. So that oxytocin allows you to identify with her, want good things from her, learn from her. And those two things together, there's some research by a guy by the name of Paul Zak, who has been doing some research for DARPA. And he says that those are what creates pro-social behavior. So when you actually want to get people to do things that are good for the world, good for each other, good for themselves, supportive, those two factors, getting those two things in your bloodstream, and they've actually taken people's blood before and after hearing a story versus hearing a list, basically, of events and not told as a story, and discovered that those two hormones are higher in your blood. And then what happens is you're more likely to say, donate money or take an action or give part of the earnings from the research away to an organization if those things happen. So that the reason that you would do that is a really biologically based good reason.
Absolutely. I was so glad that you mentioned Paul Zak. I used some of his research is cited in my book when I talk about the novelty and story. And I have also linked in the show notes for everybody to the episode on the dose brain chemicals. If you want to learn more about oxytocin, there's some information about that for sure. And there's tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of great research about story. Obviously, we'll only touch on some of it today. I know when we think about story, one of the arcs that most people are familiar with, if you've heard of any, the one is the hero's journey, right? This is the foundation of so many stories, and it may feel like you need to be more creative than that and come up with a different arc, but we just really love that hero's journey story. So would be curious if you have any examples of maybe using that arc in business, or if you have some others that people might not be familiar with that can be really powerful when telling a great story.
You're reading my mind. So the hero's journey is so complicated and has so many different steps, right? It has a lot of steps. And if you do it right, you end up with Star Wars. You end up with good stuff.
Harry Potter. Yes.
Harry Potter. Or
every, what feels like every story ever.
Right. Every classical story. Because what they did was he looked backwards at what existed in classical mythological stories that had heroes or heroines and said, this is what happened. So we're really familiar with that. But there's some really fascinating stuff out there that makes it a lot easier for the average person to use story. So there's this great organization, I don't even know if they're an organization, called the Cultural Cognition Project at Yale. And they do work on how to share scientific information with people who you disagree with, basically, which is just about everything that's going on in the world right now. How do you talk about climate change? How do you talk about COVID vaccination? How do you talk about wage inequality? Like all these things that are actually data driven. They've discovered that you can't really, like, just sharing the data doesn't bridge that gap. And so they've done a whole lot of work on what does bridge that gap. And they didn't take it as far as you and I are about to, but they basically say you have to share your experience and what you hope for in order for people to see the gap bridged. And so I've done a lot of work on using a very simple story structure that only has 3 parts, where you set the stage for what's going on, and then you describe the trouble or the crisis, and then what you did about it and the benefits from that. And it's just 3 steps. So then you can say, there was a fire. This is true. Like what I'm about to say is actually true. So there was really raging fires. I live in Colorado, in my friends and my neighborhoods over the summer. And one of the things that we'd always been told to do is cut back all of the landscaping around your house. Well, everyone wants the landscape around your house to look pretty, right? So for the folks who were like, don't worry about it, what's a few pine trees here and there, a lot of those people lost their houses. Yeah. And the folks who actually had kind of a barren yard with some rocks and some whatever were able to keep their houses. And so, what I took from that was that there's a really higher calling here in my neighborhood about your landscaping, which is that you darn well better use rocks and gravel and whatever and not lean into the trees, right? But that very simple thing, when you tell people cut back your landscaping, period, doesn't work. When you say the fire came within 100 yards of my house, but it was the way my yard was landscaped that allowed the firefighters to save my neighborhood.
Right.
People are more likely to act, right? And that's just a very simple 3-part story. And in my book, I talk about it a lot. I have the story equation, and that's all it is. And that makes it easier when you're giving a presentation, when you're talking to people, when you're trying to have a conversation with relatives who you disagree with. I was scared to get the COVID vaccine too. But when I talked to a doctor, they told me all these things that really reassured me. And and you just tell it as a story. You don't say, oh, don't be such an idiot, right? Because that doesn't get you anywhere.
Oh, that doesn't work? That's not compelling?
No, not compelling. Not at all. I mean, it might feel really good to say. Yeah. But it's not, doesn't really help. So that's fabulous, right? That we can take it down to a 3-part structure, right? That's just a story equation. And then you can have a lot more fun too, because they're all over different cultures. They have different kinds of story equations. So in Japanese story equations, the middle part gets kind of squiggly. So it's like, tell us what's going on, and then take us on a little journey where we explore the things that we're going to need to know, and then tell us what you came to, and we'll come there with you. So that's another cool way to do it. I would tell you the name of that structure, but I mispronounce it according to my Japanese friends every time I do it. So, but it's the Japanese story structure that's in a lot of anime, cartoons and stuff. So if you've ever watched any good Japanese cartoons, chances are you've actually seen that story structure. There's a griot structure that are in certain parts of West African storytelling tradition, where they tell stories that are both sweet and salty. And that contrast helps you understand decision making and all kinds of things, because they give you a little bit of sweet and a little bit of salty. So that's another cool story structure. So I think, there's more out there than Joseph Campbell's, monomyth, like the hero's journey. And plus, like, who in the world wants to set up a presentation, right? with 12 slides to capture the 12 steps of the hero's journey, right? I mean, that's just a lot. So you really only need 3.
Right. There's a reason that's used in epic tomes, right? Like, it's the long.
Right. You need like nine Harry Potter novels that are 800 pages thick to get through that.
To make it happen really, really well, that you can experience that. So I love hearing and seeing these different stories in the way that they've evolved, and showing it's such a great balance in the, nature, nurture, brain development, putting, tribes of people together as they develop over time. And everybody has story, but the way that it has resonated, what's carried through in this area, Africa versus Asia versus Western cultures, just a little bit different nuance, but still all showing that story matters no matter where you are. And you can tell them in different ways. But, there's some tips, I guess, in the way that you talk about it. So, curious question from me here would be, is there a lesson to be learned there that if you were working on international teams, do you need to change up the type of story structure that you use if you're working in a change management or internal communication within your team? If I'm working with a team from Japan versus one from America or the UK, or do they all kind of work even if you weren't brought up with a certain type of story?
So that's a good question. I think you can answer both directions. If there's a tradition that you know really well, that you do a good job of working with, that's always great, right? Because, and that would be true of also not expecting other folks from other cultures to use your tradition, but to actually listen for what theirs is as they give it to you with a lot of mastery, right? So you get to, I think the problem is that we run things through, it's called Freytag's arc, that 3-part story structure. Oh, but that doesn't follow a Freytag's arc structure, and therefore it's right. Like, forget it. If they're a master storyteller in whatever tradition that they come from, you're going to know, and you're going to feel it because your skin will prickle, and it'll all work. So I think allowing there to be much more diversity in the way stories are told is fabulous. The other direction's good too. I did a big, huge story transformation project for a very large company. And we went all over the place, Europe and Asia. And so when I was going to Japan and China, right before COVID. So it was like November of 2019. I knew from graduate school that I knew these are alternative story structures. And I even knew the movies and the TV shows and stuff because I'd watched them. And so showing up, being able to say, like, this is what I know about story structure where you're from, talk to me about it, was really useful. And then people got really into it and sharing it back. So we ended up doing the storytelling workshop and me saying, all right, do it your way. And let me learn from you a little bit. And they had so much to offer, but it worked because I knew enough going in to, number one, know I am never going to be the expert in someone else's story structure, but that I can ask questions and be curious and be kind of super into it. And that worked both in Japan and then also in China. I have actually studied a lot of Chinese stuff because I did ancient languages. And so I don't know any Chinese, but everyone who does translation, who I respect, for whatever reason, translates Chinese. So I was able to at least go in and say, like, here's what I know, and let's fill in the gaps. And I love giving the leeway for folks to do their tradition and to also show up knowing just enough to be helpful without ever pretending to be the expert.
Right.
So that's fun. So one of the things to do if you're on a team that's got people from all over the world or from more than one culture is like, tell me one of your favorite stories from when you were a kid and listen and try to see like what are the parts of it and how does it work? And telling, those are things I often will do as openers with groups. Tell me your favorite love story. Because if we're going to talk about pro-social behavior, right, that's a good way to start. Tell me your favorite hero story, or tell me your favorite, the plot of your favorite book or movie from when you were a kid, right? And that way you get to hear how people tell you their stories, and you don't correct them and say, well, what you really need is ascending action in the first third of the book that's met by, the first third of the story that's met by, because that may not be the structure.
Right. That's a really great way to kick off a session too, because you can also hear so much about what people are passionate about, and it can build an affinity where if I'm talking about Harry Potter and someone else is like, I love Harry Potter, but you wouldn't necessarily know or talk about it versus, the Star Wars people and the Romeo and Juliet people, you get to learn a lot about colleagues that you might not have otherwise known or gotten to. It also helps with that, in-group biases versus out of group biases. And I want to make a note too, when you were talking about having the participants helping to shape the workshop when you were there, that's a lot of using the IKEA effect. And for the audience listening, I'll have a link to that episode in the show notes as well. But helping them to participate in shaping the experience will make it so they are more invested and more likely to want to move forward. They're part of the story, which makes it a very different experience overall. They're more invested and can have it just be that much more effective.
Yes, very much so. And there's a concept called priming, which I'm sure you talked about. But when you choose what kinds of stories you'd like people to open a session with, whether it's a meeting or in this case, it's a long, day-long event. If you ask the right questions, you're priming them to reach into their memory or their brain or their body or wherever and come up with already the feeling that you'd like them to have. And the feeling that you'd like to bring to the work that you're doing, or the feeling that they're going to need to bring for their clients or their customers. And so it works very well also in organizations that have a really strong why, right? Or a credo-based organization where they know why they're doing it. If you can bring that into the room in a really tactile way, people will spend the rest of the day leading from that place.
Yeah, absolutely. I was remembering when we were just talking here, one of the things that I've done and have used quite a bit when I'm doing my day-long workshops and whatnot, and we're trying to make sure you got people across teams that don't necessarily know each other very well, needing them to open up. I've used a tool called Story Cubes, which and so I love these. And for anyone who's not familiar, I'll link to some in the show notes too. They're a lot of fun, but they're just dice. And on each side, they have little kind of squiggly looking pictures that you can interpret in different ways. And so you roll the dice and then you have to tell a story based on what came up, something that you remember from when you were a kid or whatever, but the images will bring up something different for me than somebody else. And you get to learn something totally random versus if you were to say, just tell us a story from when you were a kid. It's hard to grab something. Whereas if you see there's one with a bumblebee on it, you would remember, this time when my sister got stung by a bee or whatever, which is a story you never would have told, but it just makes such a difference. So I really like story cubes. Do you have any good story cube stories?
So I use story cubes all the time, which I love, but then I also created, and of course nobody's gonna be able to see them but you, but I created these story cards. I had a friend whose daughter was in graduate school and she was studying art in an MFA program. So I got her to find amongst the people she knew and just folks who are artists, all of these really evocative pictures. So I have these cards that have 100 different just pictures on them that were from these art students. And then I use those all the time to have people tell stories. So then all the story arcs that I use, so, like the Freytag's pyramid and the 3-part story, they're cards for those too. So then when people are learning to say, put a presentation together or do whatever, you can put the card on the floor, lay the pictures out around it and tell the story from the pictures. Because this picture brings up the feeling that goes with the story. And that's probably the best thing to take away from this is it's the details that evoke feelings that make the story work. So when you were talking about Sarah, the nurse, and she's walking her kids to school, that'll stick. I don't have enough money to both pay for gas for the car to drive the kids to school and pay for sandwiches. Right. And those details really stick in your mind and they bring up a feeling. And the feeling is what anchors the story and anchors the learning and also the change. So yeah, anything you can do to add visuals to storytelling is a really good idea because it helps to evoke the feelings in another way also, right? So you're telling, you're showing, and people are getting it.
Right. Well, I do a lot of presentations, as I know you do as well. And my slides where people ask, can we have your slides for anyone who can't attend? Say, yeah, sure. It's just a lot of images. So, there's that. I know what they mean. When I see this slide with penguins on it, I know what I'm going to talk about. And it doesn't necessarily need to have all the words, but by using chunking techniques, I know when this slide comes up, it's got something to do with priming. And I know I'm at a conference with bankers versus veterinarians versus entrepreneurs. And so this is the example I'm going to use that I can just very quickly get that versus having a super memorized verbatim script, which you can get stuck, knowing it's about that moment and that I'm priming what I want them to feel and grab onto with the image, which ties in with what I'm talking about, even if it feels a little bit strange, maybe if it's a silly picture or something, but it helps. It's all part of telling that story and keeping them engaged along the way.
Yeah. Sensory details in storytelling are so important. And if you can evoke the feeling with the slide, then as they're going to be feeling it as you tell the story, again, helping them to get there with you or with each other in a more efficient way, right? It's using our biology and the way our brains and bodies work to benefit how we do things and to benefit learning and to benefit group cohesion and to, for things that are really hard to talk about. I've done a lot of work this year on diversity, inclusion, justice within organizations. And when you're talking about things that evoke a trauma response, which those things often do for everybody, we've all played a part in some way in that situation. And so it evokes trauma on different levels for different folks. To be able to use a biologically based system for talking about it allows people to have better conversations, be more open, feel more grounded while they're doing it, right? And all that stuff is a product of storytelling, and therefore it's really easier to get there. I always know when I'm like a speaker at something and they have some expert who's going to come in and talk about diversity and they start pulling up the slides with the percentages and the whatever, I just think we all know, we all intellectually know things are unfair and really whatever, systemically unfair, but make me feel it. So that, right, make people feel it so that they come towards each other with feeling. And so I think it's appropriate to everything from talking to bankers about client relations. I have a great, conversation that I had with a bunch of insurance agents, because people are showing up on your doorstep to buy insurance and talking about the bad stuff that's going to happen, right? Like, you don't sell insurance because everything's going to be great. So how do you have conversations with people about potentially traumatic events, right? You tell them stories that help them understand sort of how it would feel to feel a little bit more secure. And then on the converse, one of the things that they mentioned to me is they hear a lot of stories. So story listening becomes a really important part of the job too, right? That bankers and insurance agents and, social workers and police officers, nurses, all these people spend a lot of time listening. And you can also develop skills at being a really good story listener and evoke good stories from people in ways that are healing to the people telling the stories.
Yeah. When you were talking about the insurance piece, it was also making me think about the availability bias, which I will link to the episode on that in the show notes, which is essentially, you were talking about fires earlier. And so when are people most likely to get fire insurance? Right after a fire, not necessarily when you needed it, which is before. And then enough time goes by and you think, I haven't ever had to use that. I'm going to drop it off my insurance. And then, fires come back right after the fact. So that awareness and making something real, the best time to be selling insurance for floods and fires and earthquake protection and whatever is right after some other traumatic event has happened that's gained a lot of publicity, because it's very much in people's minds. And there are a lot of stories that we're hearing on the news that's making it feel more relevant to us, even if we're not there, that can make you want to take an action.
Right. And storytelling and the emotional response to storytelling is part of our decision-making functions. Right. I think it's probably like anybody who reads any neuroscience knows the story of the guy who couldn't make decisions, right? Because he had damage to the affective centers of his brain and feeling function. This is a pretty famous story by a very famous neurologist. And decision making is impossible without feeling. And stories are what evoke feelings. So if you need people to be making a decision in the room while you're there, you need to be telling stories along with the data that you're giving them, because otherwise all the possible outcomes, buying insurance or not buying insurance, kind of feel emotionally the same. Like, if I bought insurance, I'd have insurance and that would be fine, but then I'd be out some money. And we have this tendency to bias certain outcomes, right? Like opportunity cost, right? We bias certain outcomes that are different. We're biased against them, right? That's going to cost me something. And we don't tend to have a bias against the things that are going on in the present that are actually costing us and we don't know about. And so one of the ways that those evoking those feelings helps is you can say like, oh, actually just sitting here in my neighborhood having bad landscaping should be concerning to me, right? But it feels like, oh, it'll be fine. It's always been that way, right? And that's where the storytelling comes in, to be able to say, well, maybe it was always that way, but let's think about ways it could be different, right? So there's a lot of work in the communications world about those biases, but storytelling definitely gets people over the hump of overvaluing their current state and undervaluing a change.
Yep. Getting past that status quo bias, which I just did an episode on. So good timing on that.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah.
Knowing that you do day-long plus workshops on these sorts of things, and there are dissertations and years of research going into, of course, the expertise that you have. But if you were going to give just some top tips for people who have a hard time, say, getting people on board with their ideas at work, who struggle to change other people's minds, and if they want to try to use story either in just verbal conversations or when they're doing a presentation to a team or up on a stage, what are kind of the top things to do and look for? Where should they start?
Start by listening. Start by listening to other people's stories and hear what you like and what doesn't work for you. You know, I work with a lot of other consultants often, and I know whose kind of storytelling I like, and it would even be possible for me to do. One of the consultants I've worked with a lot is like an ex, college football player, and he's very slick and very like whatever, charismatic, and that's just not me. And so I listen to him tell stories and I think, well, that's really nice, but I'll never be able to do that, and I'm the person who's going to walk in, drop the books, like something's going to go wrong. I had a spider fall in my hair once in the middle of a presentation. Those are the things that are going to happen to me. So I have to know, number one, what I like in other stories. And number two, like what's really possible for me to do. And knowing yourself and telling stories from a very authentic place is much more useful than me trying to be slick.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the first two things to do. Listen to other people's stories and figure out, oh, I like that. And then realize like, this is who I am in the world. And I need to be comfortable with telling stories from that place. And then it actually is a really great skill to be a good story listener. Practice asking people the story questions and seeing what happens. So you say, what was going on? What did you do about it? And what happened? Those are the 3 story questions. What's going on? What did you do about it? And what happened? And see what they tell you back and see how you can guide them into super comfortable storytelling. And once you're kind of good at being a story listener, you can flip it around and tell stories from the point of view of being a storyteller, right? Because you've gotten good at taking your audience into consideration. So that's the best advice I can give. I think it's natural. That's how we learn to love stories in the first place, is to have them told to us.
Right. But from a very, very young age, from the beginnings, we're always hearing stories with morals and things that we learn. And we remember those, again, more than just don't do that. Versus, the boy who cried wolf or, whatever it is that we're able to learn from beneath the story. Funny enough, my second grader was having to learn about and was talking about stories and the lessons underneath. It's like what he's learning about in school right now. We're talking about it this morning. I thought, oh, what perfect timing. It's so serendipitous that we're having this conversation today. So with those 3 questions, the what's going on, what'd you do about it, and what happened, does that follow that 3-point kind of story arc that you were talking about?
That is exactly the 3-point story arc.
Yeah.
Because what's going on is like the baseline, blah, 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 things were happening. And then something happened, right? Like there was a fire in my neighborhood and you had to do something about it. And that's the place where the trouble happens and you resolve the trouble. And then, what's going on, what did I do about it? And what happened when you did that? Like, because if you tell people how to feel about something, most people will push back against it, right? We don't like to be told what to do. But if you ask people to tell you in their own experience what happened to them, you just want to reach towards it and understand it better. So if you say, this is what was going on, this is what I did about it, and this is what happened for me, then the person will go, oh, I wonder what would have happened for me in that situation, right? And they start to take it in much more deeply than if you tell them you're supposed to feel this way about this thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. When we first started wearing masks, a year ago, I had just been in Japan, where it's a very polite thing to do to wear a mask on the subway. And so as I was leaving my nice business hotel in Tokyo, I was walking out of the door and the doorman had masks for the Westerners who didn't understand that this is what you were supposed to do. And he would hand you the masks and say, for politeness, for politeness. Right. And he wasn't like, it was so nice, like genuinely nice. And like they'd figured out how to explain it. And so I thought about that a lot when we started having to wear masks in the US. I was thinking it's just for politeness.
Right.
Like you're taking care of the people around you. It's politeness. And that story stuck with me. Like if he had said, stupid Westerners, you never know to wear masks, when really what you need to do is make sure you're not sharing your germs that you brought from America with all these unsuspecting people on the street, right? I would have been a little less likely to feel good about it. But because he just sort of, like, for me, I do this for politeness was basically what he was saying. And he hands you the mask. And so it made a much quicker behavior change for me. I took the mask, put it on, and I was like, I'm polite in Japan.
Right.
And I think that because he didn't tell me what I was supposed to feel about it, he actually told me his motivation. Mm-hmm. It worked.
Right. And you're already primed when you're traveling to a culture like Japan, where that you're going to do things wrong and you don't want to accidentally offend people. I think for most people, when you know that you are traveling to a place that's very different than where you're from, you do a lot of research of how can I avoid the dumb things that other people do? What's nice in my culture that's very offensive here. And so to say, like, I assume this is getting into our nudging piece too.
Right, exactly.
You were expecting error, that you don't know this. I'm going to give you some feedback. I made it really easy for you. Here's the mask. It's at a moment where you need it right now. And I've given you just the little bit that you need to help you take that good action. So simple nudge to change behavior.
It's a simple nudge, and it's a very positive nudge, right? It's saying, you know, like, you go get him, lady. Like, you go out there and be polite, you know? Like, there's something very uplifting about that. And that I just have, it obviously then it became very pertinent in America. So it stuck with me. But there is that story does all of those things. I mean, all of those things that you research on behavior change, and you realize that story actually has those things, right? Because as you're telling a story where things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse, and people are trying things, a lot of those things you actually read as a reader as nudges. Oh, they should have done this. Oh, they should have done that. Oh, why didn't they do that? Oh, right. And by the time they actually do it, you're so over it because you're like, I figured that out 10 pages ago, right? And that's part of the amazing thing, is that story works with all of this, you know, like behavioral science that we're beginning to understand about ourselves. And because it knows it culturally, because it comes from really long historical wisdom traditions that we've been part of for, you know, thousands of years. That's where our storytelling traditions come from. Right. I mean, that's when we started talking about the hero's journey. It looked back thousands of years through storytelling tradition, and all that wisdom we're getting proven to us through social sciences, through neuroscience, through behavioral economics. We're having all these things prove to us that story already does.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And just showing why it's so powerful. And I love this breakdown of making it really simple to use it yourself. Like you said, the 12-part hero's journey with tons of research and foreshadowing and so much you would have to do to make it happen. So breaking that into a really simple structure, anybody can ask these 3 questions, answer them, build it in, you know, kind of, and go from there. So that is just really fantastic advice. Thank you so much. And would say, is there anything that we should have asked or talked about as we wrap things up? I'll of course give you then a moment to share about best way to get in contact with you, learn more. We'll link to your book in the show notes, all that good stuff.
Just know that everybody's good at it, right? Everybody can be a great storyteller. And I think people think in the same way, like, oh, I can't draw or I can't sing, that I'm not good at it. And just know that you actually are. But do those 2 things, like listen and figure out who you are, the way you tell stories, but just know it's in there.
Right. We're born with it. It's who we are as a species. So,
and we're acculturated with it our whole lives. And I think we just have an idea that it's more complicated than it is. And it's really not.
That's great. Great advice for sure. So go ahead then, give us a little bit. What's the best way to find you? Social handles, websites, name of your book, you know.
Okay. So the book I wrote is called Resilience, the Life-Saving Skill of Story. And you can get it anywhere you normally would buy a book. It's everywhere. And I have a website for my writing that's michelleauerbach.com, just first name, last name.com. And then the website that I use for my work, for my like consulting work, is called Modica Communications, Modaka Communications. Modica is there's a story behind it. Let's just put it that way. There's a great story about what Modica is, but it's a kind of dessert that is liked by a change agent in a story. So that's why the name, but you can find me there. I also am on Instagram as Michelle Auerbach. If you go to my website and you sign up for my newsletter, I send out a newsletter once a week, usually on Thursdays, that has a really cool story I heard that week, a recipe, because I feel like that's a way we tell each other cultural stories. There's always food. And then the third thing is a bunch of stories to follow that I've found interesting. So, you know, essays I've read, or just really great storytelling examples so that people can sort of up their story IQ. So that if you sign up for that on my website, you'll get it and get to choco flan this week, which was what
there you go. Right. That's
yeah.
And I love that, just, you know, as we kind of wrap up, that there's, when we think about our businesses and you feel like you have to have this very specific academic-y, whatever newsletter, or it's kind of all about you, which I mean, for you sharing recipes, I'm sure is something that you like as well that you're already doing, but knowing it's a type of a tip that I would want, like, ooh, what's the recipe today? And I want to go in and find that thing, you know, the New York Times having the crossword or whatever is, something that you look forward to, want to go in and check out. So that in itself is a story and a lesson in engaging with people and making it that they actually want to open your newsletter. So really great tip, even in just something that you do all the time now. So thank you so much for sharing that and just for being here today. It's been great to talk stories with you.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful to talk to you. I'm very excited about the work you're doing. And so this was very fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to Dr. Michelle Auerbach for joining me on the show today. Is your brain now buzzing with the power of story? Where could you use story in your business? Be it change management, like we discussed a bit today, or in persuasive presentations, or in creating more compelling sales pitches. They're all more effective when you use the power of story because, as Michelle said, emotions are needed to make a decision. Are you helping the people you engage with to feel something? Take a moment now and think of one point in your business where you could use story to be effective, and consider again those questions Michelle said to ask. Take some notes if you have the time. What's going on? What did you do? What happened? Of course, to learn more about using this story framework in your business, pick up your own copy of Michelle's book, Resilience, the life-changing skill of story. There is, again, a link in the show notes, along with ways to get in touch with her, to learn more about her work, to learn more about and join the course I'm teaching on using stories to give better presentations, and links to all those past episodes, like the one about Disney from last week, where I also talked a lot about story, in case you want some more inspiration about using stories in business. That's a great place to start. It's all waiting for you right within the app you're listening to, or at thebrainybusiness.com/145. And as a reminder, my new book, What Your Customer Wants and Can't Tell You, is now on pre-sale on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and many other sites from around the world. And there are links for you in the show notes, of course. I'll be talking about it in detail in an episode of the podcast coming in 2 weeks, but wanted to let you know that if you just can't wait for a little taste of my book, you can get a free chapter when you visit thebrainybusiness.com. There's a link to the direct page in the show notes, and probably a link in the show notes for you as well. There is still time to join the launch team for the book, which will give a lucky group a sneak peek of the full book and other fun as we get ready for the launch in May. Want to be considered for the launch team? Fill out the form in the show notes by Monday, April 5th, 2021. And yes, even international listeners should fill this out if you want to participate. It'll be a little different for those in the US and those international because of publication dates and things like that. But we can still get started on the fun. Thanks again for everyone who's already purchased a book on presale. It's been so fun to watch it already climbing up the ranks on Amazon. I appreciate you all and can't wait until you are going to get your copy in your hands in a few short weeks. As we close out this week's episode, I want to give one more thank you to Dr. Michelle Auerbach for joining me on the show today. It was wonderful to chat with and learn from you. Next week, on episode 146, Kwame Christian is back to talk about using anchoring as a negotiation tool. We talk about salary negotiations and so much more. It's going to be a lot of fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Molina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.